our last video, we talked about view binding. Before moving on to data binding and view model, we will talk about fragments. In our sample app, we use an activity for our UI. That is not a good practice. It is better to use fragments for our UI. Fragments are better suited to define and manage UI of a single screen. Fragment represents reusable portion of your app's UI. It's about more dynamic and flexible UI design. Fragment must be hosted by an activity or another fragment. So we will move the UI elements to a fragment and our activity will host this fragment. Activities act as a frame that contains the fragments. UI fragments operates like a view in the activity, but it has its own layout, its own life cycle, and it can handle its own input events. Activities are ideal place to put global elements around your app's user interface, such as a navigation drawer, a toolbar, modern navigation, and fragments are better suited to define and manage UI of a single screen or a portion of screen. You can use multiple fragments with single activity. This introduces modularity and reusability to our code. Okay, and let's move our UI elements from our activity to fragment. This is the layout of our activity. We will move all these UI element from our activity to a new fragment. First, we will create a new package. It's better to arrange your code inside packages. Give it a name play. Now we will create a new fragment inside the play package. Select the blank fragment. Give it a name play fragment. Layout will be automatically created by the Android Studio. Click finish. Yeah, our fragment is created. We don't need all these code. We only want this on create view. Delete everything else. Okay. Now go to our layout file, fragment play. This is your layout. It only has a text view. We have to copy all our UI elements from our activity to this fragment. Okay. Delete the text view. Copy our UI elements from the activity. Paste it inside our fragment. Now delete that also. App is showing an error. Copy that from our activity. Now the error is gone. Everything looks same as our activity. Now convert our fragment into a data binding layout. Okay. Now delete the frame layout. We don't need that. Okay, everything is done. Now go to our activity main.xml. We don't need data binding in our activity, so we will convert it into a linear layout. Change the orientation to vertical. Go to your main activity. We have moved our UI elements to the fragment, so we don't need that anymore. So delete those codes. Okay, set content view to our activity main layout. Our activity doesn't have any UI elements. All our UI elements are in our fragment, and fragment cannot exist on its own. It must be hosted in an activity. So go back to our activity main.xml. We will include our fragment in our activity main layout. Set its layout height and width to match parent. Give an ID for our fragment. We will use play fragment as ID. In the name attribute, give the fully qualified class name of our fragment. Yeah, now our activity is hosting our fragment. Let's build our app so that we can use the binding object. We are using a view binding in our fragment. We will use the binding class generated by the compiler for binding our views. So first create a binding object. The binding class name will be same as our fragment name, which is fragment play binding. Use it to inflate our view. Return binding dot root. Yeah, next we need to implement the click listener of our play button. We can use the binding object to reference our views. We can use binding.bt play to reference our play button. bt play is its id in the xml file. Like that, we can use binding.tv score to reference our text view. Okay, everything is finished. We have the fragment which has all the ua elements and activities hosting this fragment. So let's run our app. Our app is running fine.